There are moments in a priest's life that forever mark the soul, not with noise or fanfare, but with quiet, unmistakable power. This is one such moment. The story begins with Father Michael, a gentle, soft-spoken priest who had served his parish faithfully for years. By the time this moment unfolded, he had already celebrated hundreds of masses, heard countless confessions, baptized babies, buried loved ones, and sat beside the dying. He was a man devoted to Christ, and yet, like many who carry the weight of daily ministry, he had begun to feel an ache deep within him. Not a lack of faith, not doubt, but a quiet yearning for more, for something deeper, something more real, more vivid than what he could explain in homilies or pastoral counseling. He didn't voice it aloud, not even in prayer, but heaven had heard it anyway. It was the still weeks after Easter, during the slower rhythm of springtime in the parish. Flowers still lingered near the altar, their scent clinging softly to the walls. The pews were half full on Sundays. The children were preparing for First Communion. The sacristy buzzed with quiet movement, as it always did. But Father Michael, he was restless. He found himself walking into the empty church more often alone, early in the mornings, or late after evening meetings. The silence was comforting. He'd sit in the last pew and simply look toward the tabernacle, heart open, yet without words. He often remembered something his seminary professor once said: a priest's greatest danger is not sin, it's spiritual fatigue dressed as routine. And perhaps that's what he was feeling now. Fatigue, not in body, but in soul. He loved God dearly, but he longed to feel God loving him back, not in doctrine or duty, but in a moment, a real moment. One Friday, something prompted him to do what he hadn't done in months. He set up for Eucharistic Adoration, quietly, with no announcement, no bulletin notice, no schedule, just a single candle, a monstrance, and the body of Christ placed on the altar. He dimmed the lights, the chapel filled with gold and shadows. Then he knelt. It was supposed to be an hour, but that night, Father Michael didn't move. His hands folded, his breathing slowed. His thoughts, for once, were still. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't recite prayers. He just stayed. And somewhere in that silence, something began to stir, not in the room but within him. He came back the next night, and the next, and soon, without meaning to, he found himself in a new rhythm: adoration in the evenings, mass in the mornings, confessions in between, and always a silent watching, a waiting. It wasn't long before the word began to spread. A few parishioners noticed the open doors at odd hours. Some wandered in. An older woman stayed for hours, her rosary beads slipping quietly between her fingers. A teenager from the youth group came in and sat, eyes wide, silent, tears slipping down her cheek. No one spoke, but something sacred was happening. Still, Father Michael said nothing. He wasn't trying to build a movement or start a new program. He was just making space for God. And then came the night, a night that would split his life into before and after. It had been a long day, a funeral in the morning, a hospital visit in the afternoon, an anointing late in the evening. Father Michael was tired. He almost didn't go into the church. Almost, but something nudged him gently. Go. He entered the darkened sanctuary. Only the sanctuary lamp glowed, a gentle red flame. The monstrance was already placed from earlier that day. No one else was there. He walked slowly down the aisle, genuflected, and knelt. The silence was thick, holy, and then it happened. At first, it was just a sense, a shift in the air, like something invisible had entered the room. He opened his eyes slowly. The host, it glowed, not the kind of glow from a candle, not imagination, not metaphor. It glowed, softly, radiantly, as if light were pouring from within it, not blinding, not flashy, but unmistakable. And then his breath caught, because standing behind the altar, not in a vision, not in a dream, but in reality as real as the marble beneath his knees, was a man, clothed in radiant white, eyes filled with mercy and depth, wounds visible in his hands, and light, golden, living light seemed to shimmer from him like mist at sunrise. It was Jesus. Jesus, not an image, not a statue, not a memory from Scripture, but him, the same Jesus who broke bread with the disciples, who wept at Lazarus' tomb, who stood before Pilate, who rose from the dead. He stood there now, on the altar, looking down at Father Michael with love. The priest couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. His heart thundered in his chest. His hands trembled. Tears spilled freely down his face. Then Jesus spoke, not aloud, not with sound, but with a voice that filled every corner of Father Michael's being. You called, and I came. Father Michael could only weep. All the hidden longing, the unspoken ache, the fatigue, the yearning for more, it was all answered in that one moment. And then Jesus stepped forward, not walking, not floating, just moving gracefully, powerfully until he stood directly above the monstrance, and then within it. The glow of the Eucharist flared, then softened, settling into a gentle light that remained. Father Michael collapsed forward, face to the marble floor, unable to speak, overwhelmed by the holiness that surrounded him. Time stood still. He didn't know how long he remained there. Minutes, hours. But when he finally rose, the church was silent, the air thick with peace. The glow had faded, but something in him had changed forever. He knew what he had seen, and he would never be the same. When Father Michael woke the next morning, it took him a few seconds to realize he wasn't dreaming. He had barely slept, and yet he wasn't tired. Something had changed, not around him, but within him. There was a stillness in his chest, the kind that only follows an encounter with the divine. The memory of what had happened the night before was as clear as the rising sun, and it wasn't just a memory. It was a mark, a holy wound of all that had stitched itself into his soul. But how could he explain it to anyone who would believe that Jesus had appeared to him not in a vision, not in metaphor, but truly? And yet, Father Michael felt no pressure to convince, just a quiet certainty. The encounter wasn't meant to be hidden, but it also didn't need to be forced. He would simply return to the chapel and wait. And so he did. That night, and the next, and the next, he placed the Eucharist on the altar just as before. He knelt, he watched, he waited, and even though he didn't see Jesus appear in the same visible form again, the presence never left. It clung to the room, saturated the air. You could feel it in your skin, like standing at the edge of a great ocean and knowing somehow the tide was drawing near. And the people noticed. It began quietly. A couple from the Tuesday Bible study wandered in after evening errands. They stayed an hour longer than they meant to. The next day, they returned with their daughter. Then came an older gentleman who hadn't been to church in years. He sat in the back, arms crossed, but his eyes never left the host. When he finally left, his eyes were red. Father Michael said nothing. He didn't need to. The presence was doing the speaking. Within weeks, the parish began to change, not in loud, visible ways, but like roots growing silently beneath the earth. People lingered after Mass. Confessions increased. A young man who had been struggling with addiction asked to speak with Father Michael privately. A single mother, burdened by exhaustion and shame, quietly slipped into the back pew one evening and sat in front of the monstrance for nearly 2 hours. When she finally stood, she whispered, "I've never felt so held in my life." And still, Father Michael told no one about what he had seen, until one evening 6 weeks after that sacred encounter, a young seminarian named Alex approached him after adoration. Alex was quiet, thoughtful, the kind who reads St. John of the Cross for leisure. He had been shadowing Father Michael that summer as part of his formation. On that particular night, Alex lingered long after everyone had gone. Father Michael noticed the seminarian pacing near the sanctuary steps, brow furrowed. After a moment, Alex looked up and spoke. "Father, may I ask you something strange?" Father Michael nodded gently. "Of course." Alex's eyes filled with tears. "Has anyone seen him? I mean really seen him? Here?" The question hung in the air like incense. Father Michael didn't answer right away. He walked slowly to the front pew, sat down, and gestured for Alex to sit beside him. "What makes you ask that?" he said softly. Alex looked toward the monstrance. "I was praying tonight," he said, "and for a few seconds I thought I saw something. No, someone. I thought I was imagining it, but then I felt like someone was looking at me. Not harsh, not judging, just looking, with love. And then this thought filled my head. I am here. That's all. Just that. Father Michael placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You're not crazy," he said. "He is here." And then, for the first time, he shared what had happened. Not as a grand story, not with flourish, just truth. Alex wept. They sat in silence for a long time after. That conversation marked the beginning of a shift not just in the parish, but in Father Michael himself. The encounter was no longer his secret, and as more and more people came to adore, he began to realize God wasn't asking him to keep this to himself. God wanted to be known, but he didn't want fireworks. He wanted silence, stillness, an open heart. And so Father Michael began to gently encourage his parishioners, not with announcements or emails, but with quiet invitations. "Would you like to come sit with the Lord? Do you have 15 minutes after work? Bring nothing, just yourself." And people came, and something began to grow. Not a movement, not a ministry, but a presence, a hunger, a holy longing. One evening, a married couple named Peter and Ruth arrived. They had been on the verge of divorce. Years of resentment had hardened their hearts. They didn't speak as they entered, didn't hold hands, just sat apart, eyes cast downward. But an hour passed, then another. And before they left, Ruth reached out and took Peter's hand. They didn't say a word, but their hearts knew something had happened. Later that week, they signed up to help keep the chapel open late on Thursdays. Another night, a teenager named James, known for being quiet, always with headphones in, distant, came to adoration. His mother had dragged him there. He sat near the back, clearly bored, but then something shifted. Father Michael watched him slowly remove his headphones, then his cap, then his shoes, and finally, James knelt. After adoration ended, he lingered. When Father Michael approached him and asked if he was okay, the boy whispered, "He's real, isn't he?" Father Michael nodded. That simple affirmation changed everything. James began attending daily mass. A few months later, he joined the youth group. Then he started leading it. Everywhere, the fruit of that holy night was growing. But it wasn't just the parishioners who were being changed. Father Michael himself was being remade. He no longer felt the fatigue that once haunted him. He no longer carried the quiet sadness he had learned to mask. There was joy now, peace, purpose, not because everything in his life was easy, not because every prayer had been answered, but because he had seen him. And once you see the Lord, once you encounter his presence in truth, everything else is different. One day, while sitting in his office, Father Michael received a letter. It was from a man named Carlo, who had visited the church while passing through town. He had come during adoration and sat silently in the back. Father Michael hadn't noticed him at the time. The letter read, "Dear Father, I was visiting your church a few weeks ago. I had no intention of staying. Honestly, I was angry. I hadn't set foot in a church in over a decade, but something told me to stop. I walked in during adoration. I don't even know what that meant at the time. I just saw the host on the altar and something stopped me. I sat in the last pew. I planned to leave quickly, but I couldn't move. And then I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace, real peace, and presence. I can't explain it, but I knew he was there. Not like a symbol, not like a memory, but him. I cried for a long time. I hadn't cried since my father died. But that night, everything broke open, and for the first time, I felt held. Thank you for leaving the doors open. Thank you for letting him be seen. I've returned to confession. I've started praying again. I'm taking steps I never thought I could take, all because he was there. And so was I. Gratefully, Carlo. Father Michael folded the letter slowly and held it to his heart. Tears filled his eyes once more, not from sorrow, but from gratitude. He thought again of that night when Jesus appeared, the look in his eyes, the words he had spoken. "You called, and I came, and then just place me here, and I will do the rest." Those words were still true, still guiding him, still shaping his priesthood. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't the source of miracles. He was simply a witness. a custodian of presence, a man who had knelt and been changed. Years later, the Adoration Chapel was always open. From sunrise to nightfall, someone was always there. Sometimes a dozen, sometimes just one, but always someone. And even when the pews were empty, Father Michael believed he knew the Lord remained. Because once Jesus comes, he doesn't leave. Not in spirit, not in silence. Not even when the candles burn low or the people stop singing. He stays. That was the miracle, and the world needs miracles more than ever. Father Michael had now been a priest for over 2 decades. He had witnessed hundreds of sacraments, counseled countless souls, stood in hospital rooms where hope had vanished, and grave sites where tears fell like rain. But nothing had changed his life more than that single night when Jesus stood on the altar and spoke to him. He never forgot the words, "Just place me here, and I will do the rest." It was so simple. No grand strategy, no perfect sermon, just presence. The presence of the Lord. That was the power that healed marriages. That was the force that broke addictions. That was the voice that silenced shame, restored hope, and awakened vocations. And all it took was stillness. A door left open, a priest willing to step aside. The longer he lived, the more Father Michael realized the world isn't thirsting for more noise. It's thirsting for silence filled with someone. And Jesus, especially in the Eucharist, offers exactly that. One evening, a college student named Elise came to adoration after a devastating breakup. She had been raised Catholic, but life had pulled her away. She came with anger, with questions, with heartache so sharp she couldn't breathe. She sat in the back, arms crossed, eyes puffy from tears. But something happened. A quiet warmth filled her chest. Not fireworks, not a voice from the clouds, just warmth. And then, one sentence bubbled up from within her spirit. A sentence she hadn't read, hadn't planned. It simply arrived. "You are still mine." She burst into tears. It was all she needed to hear. Later that night, she whispered to Father Michael, "I didn't think I was welcome anymore, but he told me I still am." Father Michael smiled. He's good at that. Another time, a young man battling suicidal thoughts came during a late-night hour. He didn't want to pray. He wanted to say goodbye. But when he sat before the monstrance, something cracked. He felt watched, but not like surveillance. Watched like a child is watched by a father. Watched like someone who matters. He knelt, and though he didn't hear words, something shifted in him. He stayed. He returned the next day. 2 months later, he told Father Michael, "That night saved me." And again, Father Michael said nothing, because the words weren't his. They never had been. Sometimes the miracles weren't dramatic. A mother, exhausted from caring for a sick child, sat in the front pew and fell asleep mid-rosary. When she woke, she said, "I felt like I slept in his arms." A widow came every Thursday. She never said a word, just looked at the host with watery eyes. One day, she whispered, "It's the only place I feel held." A man who had left the church for decades returned with trembling hands and said, "I don't even know what to do in there. But when I sit with him, I remember who I am." And that's the thing. Adoration doesn't always give answers. It gives presence. And sometimes, that's more healing than anything else. Father Michael once preached a homily on adoration where he said, "People ask me what to do in front of the Blessed Sacrament. Should they read? Should they pray the rosary? Should they kneel or sit? And I tell them, do whatever helps you be with him. Because he's already there. He's already loving you. You're not earning anything by being there. You're just letting him be who he is, love." And that, more than anything, had become Father Michael's mission, to make space, to let Jesus be who he is. One day, a reporter came to do a story on the chapel. She wasn't Catholic. She didn't understand what she was witnessing. "Why do they sit here so long?" she asked. "There's no music, no sermon, just silence." Father Michael led her into the chapel and sat beside her. She watched. A woman knelt with a tear-streaked face. A man sat with his head bowed, eyes closed, hands open. A child pointed toward the monstrance and whispered to her mother, "That's Jesus, right?" After a while, the reporter whispered, "It's so quiet and yet so full." Father Michael smiled. She understood more than she realized. Years after that holy night, Father Michael was invited to speak at a national Eucharistic conference. Thousands had come, bishops, priests, lay leaders, all eager to discuss the future of the Church, especially in a world growing noisier and more divided. When it was his turn to speak, Father Michael stepped to the microphone slowly. He looked out over the crowd and said just a few words. We keep asking how to evangelize the world. We keep building programs, writing strategies, holding workshops. But I believe the answer is much simpler. Put Jesus on the altar. Make room for silence, and he will do the rest. Then he told the story of that night, of the glow, of the gaze, of the words, "Just place me here." The crowd was silent. A few wept. Some knelt where they stood. And at the end of the conference, more than one parish decided to open a 24-hour adoration chapel. Because Jesus is still calling you. Watching this now, maybe you've never been to Eucharistic Adoration. Maybe you've heard of it but didn't understand. Or maybe you've been away from the Church for so long, you don't know how to return. Let this be your invitation. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need the right words. You don't even need to know what to say. Just come. Come and sit. Let him look at you. Let him love you. There's no pressure, no performance, no expectations. Only presence, real, gentle, healing, because the Jesus who appeared to Father Michael that night is the same Jesus waiting for you, not just in theory, not just symbolically, truly, body, blood, soul, and divinity, right there on the altar. So find a chapel, take a step, sit down, and wait, not for lightning, not for visions, but for peace. For love, for the one who has been waiting for you, and maybe, just maybe, something will stir in your soul too. A warmth, a whisper, a truth. You are mine. And that one sentence could change your life forever. If this story moved your heart, consider visiting a Eucharistic chapel this week. And if you know someone who's searching, someone hurting, lost, or simply tired, share this video with them. Because the invitation of Jesus is always the same. Come to me and I will give you rest.